I'm often asked the question, why would you engage in such risky behavior? I don't consider myself a big risk taker, and I do manage the risk on the expeditions that I have. But people don't realize that the risk that they're living day in and day out, and they try to, I think, often, unfortunately, manage risk out of their lives to the point where they think that they're giving themselves safety, but they're just living in the illusion of safety.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. It's one thing to encounter mortality unexpectedly. It's quite another thing to voluntarily put yourself in situations where encounters with mortality are around every corner. Yet that's what my guest on this episode does often, and with jaw-dropping results. What he's learned in his years of exploring the edges of human ability will inspire you to live with more guts, gusto, and abandon than ever before, to live life in full color. Doug Tominello is an attorney by trade and a world-class adventurer at heart. His exploits include successful summits of 4 iconic mountains, including Everest and Denali, a Guinness World Record-setting team crossing of the Indian Ocean in a rowboat, a solo attempt to traverse the South Pole, and a plethora of other feats of endurance and perseverance like the Leadville Trail 100 Ultramarathon. It was, however, an unexpected encounter with mortality that prompted Doug to begin pursuing adventures that voluntarily expose him to mortality around every corner. And that's where our conversation begins today. Doug, what got you into this expedition lifestyle?
Growing up, I was interested in athletics, was engaged in sports throughout my life growing up. When I got into college, that was my first introduction really to rock climbing and to some of the more adventure-related pursuits. I'd been a skier, I'd done some rock climbing, all that. But that's when I moved to Colorado. It was after I got out of the Army and was able to really start indulging what became a passion: rock climbing, ice climbing, outdoor pursuits in general. Fast forward to when I left my time in the Army and I went to law school. Law school was very intensive, very time intensive, and with lots of requirements. I graduated from law school and went to work at a law firm and was subject to all the requirements of a new associate in a large law firm. And so I counted one period where I went 11 months without a single day off and was in the office from 7 a.m. till 11 p.m. at night often. And this went on for about 4 years. And so I found myself, like so many do, completely engaged in my occupation to the exclusion of almost everything else, and certainly everything that was fun and gave my life the real meaning.
Were you still single at this point?
I was married. No, I was married at this point. I actually had a child. We had one kid at the time. And so that was the lifestyle that I was living when I got a call from a friend of mine who let me know that a mutual friend of ours had been killed in a rock climbing accident. And he was a very, very good climber. And this was a very unfortunate accident. It was not something, certainly, obviously, that was expected. And so I went to the memorial service that was held at Neptune Mountaineering in Boulder and watched the slideshow of his life, his various climbing-related exploits, listened to the testimonials from his friends and his family, and thought to myself, maybe somewhat paradoxically, what am I doing? I'm spending my life in this job, which I enjoy, but it's taking up all my time, all my efforts, all my energy, and I'm abandoning those things that I really love, being out in the wild and in nature. And decided at that point that I was going to get back to start doing those things I really love to do in the outdoors. And the next day had started planning for an expedition to Denali, to Mount McKinley. The next day.
Holy smoke. And why not just do Denali? That'd be the first obvious choice would be.
That's exactly right. And so it went from there. And then I've been able to maintain it since, thankfully.
Is that sort of your innate style? Like if you're going to do it, you do it big?
It is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe that's a strength and maybe it's a weakness.
Well, I imagine it's a strength in the courtroom too, as a litigator.
I'm sure that it is, but I do tend to go all in.
Yeah.
maybe I found a little bit more better balance over time.
Well, but clearly that was a profound moment. You didn't go from, the loss of your friend, and that's of course why this podcast exists, is help us to capture the power of mortality, to become the people we were made to be. And that was a defining moment for you. That it flipped a switch. You went from periods of 11 months, 12, 14, 15-hour days without a day off, to the next day planning an expedition to the highest mountain in North America. That's a powerful defining moment.
It was very much a defining moment. Fast forward from there by a few years, and I was making an announcement to my firm, somewhat requesting permission to be able to go on a Mount Everest expedition. So jumped right in with both feet, and I was on my way before I knew it.
So you were hooked pretty quickly.
I was, but that's because I'd always been hooked. And that was the catalyst that got me back to doing what I really wanted to do, and in a big way.
I'm super interested in your awareness of what occurred between having been hooked and then this, we'll just call it a dark period to be dramatic, where you're in the legal profession, you like it, but you're investing your whole life in it, and then you get hooked again. Like, what's your awareness about what allowed you to, in some ways, neglect or forsake an original passion for a period of time?
Well, it's so easy to get caught up in your life. At least it was for me. And by that, I mean caught up in the day-to-day, trying to establish a career, establishing a family. When you're doing those things, which are very worthy goals in and of themselves, but when you're, at least when I was, fully ensconced in that to the exclusion of everything else, the days go by. And the next thing you know, a year has gone by, and then years have gone by. And I do think it's important to be able to sit back and say, where have I gone? What have I done? And what have I accomplished, and why? And am I really living the purpose that I'm meant to live?
What advice would you give to listeners who are hearing your account and realizing, oh, in some ways that's me. I used to love X, or I used to want to be a fill in the blank, and here I am at whatever age, and none of that has happened. I've given my life to things that are worthwhile, but I've given my life wholly to those things and not to those old loves. What would you advise or counsel?
Well, I think Steve Jobs had the best advice on that. And his, to paraphrase, was I get up every day and I look in the mirror and ask myself if I am enjoying what I'm doing. And if too many days have gone by where I say no, then I realize that maybe I need to be doing something different.
And how would you advise someone to break free of the gravitational pull of the status quo? So let's say someone does that. They take your advice, Steve Jobs' advice. They wake up tomorrow morning, look in the mirror and go, I'm not actually enjoying this past week of normal days that I've had. I want to do something different. How then do they begin to break free of the gravitational pull of the status quo in their life and actually do something different?
Yeah, it is difficult to do. To some degree, going out to that edge is not easy because there's the potential for big loss or big sacrifice in doing that. For me, I knew that if I were to get into expedition climbing, for example, and to spend months on the road doing that there was going to be a financial consequence. There may be a consequence for my progression in the firm. But that was a risk that I was willing to undertake because I thought that the value of indulging in what I thought I needed to be doing was much more important than just the financial reward that may come as being a lawyer if I had to take that time off. As far as the how to do that, I think it's simpler than many people realize, even though it's scary. In fact, it's kind of scary simple in the sense of if there's something that people want to do, you just have to put a name to it and then put a schedule on it. And that's all you do. And then commit to that goal and commit to that schedule. I do speaking with kids, for example, high school kids. And one of the things I like to tell them is don't say you're going to do something unless you're really going to do it. Conversely, if you say you're going to do something, then do it. Commit to doing it. I think it's as simple as that. I'm going to go climb Everest. I'm going to go row across an ocean by this year or by this date. And then after that, it all becomes just details. It becomes backward planning. It becomes logistics. It becomes getting the plan in place, getting the knowledge in place, developing those tools to actually go do that thing that you've decided to do.
There's nothing more powerful. That might be hyperbole, but there's potentially nothing more powerful than that moment of true heartfelt commitment. I'm going in that direction.
Right.
And we like to think that in order to commit to going in that direction, I have to have an idea of how I'm going to get there. And Steve Harvey was the one I heard say it best. He said, your job is not the how, it's the what. If you commit to the what, then the how will unfold before you. You'll have to work through those problems, but we actually, I think, short circuit ourselves when we think we have to have the how figured out. And it's a convenient way of letting ourselves off the hook.
It's a great insight. So in fact, one of the expeditions that I did was, I was on a team that rowed a rowboat across the Indian Ocean from Western Australia to the island of Mauritius, which is off the coast of Madagascar, so off the coast of Africa. To this day, I don't even know what it really was that propelled me to start thinking about rowing across an ocean, except that I found myself thinking about that one day and wondering actually whether it was physically possible for a person to row a rowboat across an ocean. I started doing just the basic research and figured out, well, yes, in fact, it is possible and it's been done. The next thing you know, the what came into sharp focus, which is row a rowboat across an ocean, and the how took time. It took years to develop the how for me, not coming from a seafaring experience in particular, to figure out how to make all that happen. The next thing you know, I found myself in a rowboat off of the coast of Geraldton and rowing to the west.
So cool. Talk a little bit about that call. You said the idea of rowing a boat across an ocean began to call to you. What was your experience of that, and how can we evolve our relationship with whatever call we have within our hearts so that we're able to respond to it and find out why it's there?
Yeah, I think it's important to listen to the call of the heart, and so many of us don't, or we ignore it, or we pretend that it doesn't exist, or we're just not really listening all that well because we're paying attention to other things. I think we all have talents, and we certainly all have passions. And spending some time really understanding what those are, what drives and what pushes you forward. I think once you start to really understand what those motivators and what those talents are, then that's what gives you the ability to then start developing them. And I think that I'm not saying everybody has to be an expedition climber or an adventurer. Maybe your talent is in physics. Maybe it's in politics or business. Who knows what it is? But we're all given those talents. I think if we really do want to live that full life, then we have to fully develop those talents and indulge in those passions, which are very closely related to our talents, typically. And so really being able to identify them and to put a name to them, I think is critical. Again, I don't think it's really all that hard. It just takes some insight and some reflection, and then the commitment to actually, go forth and do.
And you're someone who has responded to that call, broadly speaking, to be out on adventures. And then you've responded to specific calls under that umbrella of adventure to Denali, to Everest, to the Indian Ocean. What's the benefit been to you of continuing to respond to that overarching call, the macro call, and then all of those subordinate calls underneath it? What's the benefit to you, Ben?
Well, the benefit to me is a life well lived.
How so? Break that down.
I've not gone out. I've not discovered new realms. I've not done anything along those lines. So my adventures have all been very self-motivated in the sense that they have given me the ability to not just explore my passions, but to use ingenuity and creativity and to develop perseverance and desire and drive. And so it's in many ways it's just self-development. But I think that if we're doing that, then we're on the path to living a good life with one foot in the air and, marching forward.
So one way of saying that might be if your orientation is to regularly expand your frontiers and explore new frontiers, then the fruits that we reap from that are an even better version of ourselves ultimately.
I think that's right. It helps to drive self-awareness, ingenuity. I think personally it helps me to live in love and in that sense of just doing great things and big things.
This might be hard to formulate, but imagine that you hadn't responded to that call the day after your buddy's funeral, and you knew the call was there to do something big out in the wilderness, and you knew even more specifically that it was Denali, but that day had gone differently after the funeral, and you'd felt the call to a specific mountain, and you had talked yourself out of it. Hard to know, of course, for certain, but what might the cost to you have been?
I think the cost is huge. There's a knocking on our hearts to go out and do things. And if we don't listen to that knocking, then we lose such a large part of our life, I think. Had I just gone about my day-to-day, I'm sure my life would be great, but it would be certainly much less rich than it is, less meaningful to me than it has become. And so I think those nudgings that we have in our heart are really important. It's important that we listen to those.
And in my experience, when we don't, we know when we don't listen to the nudge, and it dings our sense of ourself. We know, no one else might know, but we know that we backed away from that call, and we diminish ourselves. Somehow we undermine ourselves, I think, moving forward in a way that's undeniable. It might not be perceptible to others, but I think it plays out over time in ways that within us we're aware of and cause us to, at least think a little more poorly of ourselves than we needed to.
Perhaps so.
And that, of course, influences everything. If I think more poorly of myself, then I'm more inclined to speak a sharp word to my wife because I'm feeling badly about myself, or to be unkind to my kids. And I think there's
interesting
quite a bit here to this idea of responding to the call in our hearts. And I actually think it's not critical that we understand why that call is in our hearts, as long as it's a call within the normal range of human experience and not a call to go on some kind of crazy rampage. That's a different thing. But
true.
If the call is generally in a positive direction, it's not up to us to decide the value of doing that thing. It's simply for us to do that thing to the best of our ability.
I think that's right. And that's part of what I'm getting at when I'm saying we all have these different talents that we're born with, that we're blessed with. And developing those talents is really critical. And I do find that the talents that we have are so closely related to the call in our life that we have.
And you were given a forced moment of reflection in the form of your buddy's funeral. And it was not a gift to lose him, but the gift of that forced reflection is undeniable in your life.
It is.
And part of what we want to do here on this podcast is say, don't wait until you're forced to reflect. Do that now. And so I want to encourage our listeners to create the reflective moment or moments in your life somehow. For me, that's regular walks out on County Road 44. It works for me. I don't know why. For you, maybe it's a drive. For someone else, maybe it's journaling. But it's easy in the 21st century to completely forsake any of those practices of solitude and reflection and lose ourselves among the millions of voices vying for our attention.
Yes, very much so. And I was fortunate. I was still relatively young, of course, when this happened, but it's never too late for anybody. It's never too late for anybody to engage in that reflection and to determine what their real calling is in their life and to go down that road.
Shifting gears a little bit to some of the specifics of some of your experiences, of all the experiences you've had on expeditions, and you've had a lot of expeditions and a lot of individual experiences on those expeditions, which one has been most impactful in shaping your relationship with life and death?
When I think on the big expeditions that I've gone on, I've learned so many different lessons from each one. I guess I would have to say, though, the Indian Ocean row is the one that probably had the most impact on me in the sense of really driving home gratitude and just really giving me a real sense of gratefulness for the life that I have, the world that we live in, the nature that's available to us, and the ability to experience it with a tight-knit team and a close community, which was my teammates on the boat. And so that was just
a super close community, whether you like it or not.
Super close.
Yeah. What was it about that experience of all the expeditions that cultivated that deep gratitude and awareness?
Yeah, part of it was the location. Again, our route was from Australia to the island of Mauritius. We were in some of the most remote ocean in the world. In fact, part of the area that we rode through is the area where that I think it was a Malaysian Airlines plane went down that they looked for a year and never did find. It was there's nothing out there. There's no shipping traffic that goes through that area. There's no pleasure boats out there. There's nothing out there. And to be able to realize that you're out in the middle of nowhere is it's very awe-inspiring. And the things that I saw that we experienced on that trip were extraordinary, from the roughest of oceans We were at one point, we were in 30-foot seas and our boat capsized. But
How big was your boat?
It was 32 feet.
That's a small boat in big seas.
Yeah, small boat in big seas. So the way that we did that expedition is it was a team of 8, and so we had 4 people rowing at all times. So we did 2-hour watches or 2-hour shifts at the oars. So 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day. And we were at sea for 56 days. We were rowing in the middle of the night. There was no moon out. The stars were absolutely everywhere. And all of a sudden, these flares started coming up all around us, 360 degrees around us, purple and reds and yellow and blue. And we used our ship-to-ship radio to see if we could hail any ships that might be in the area. Couldn't find anything. Used a satellite phone to call back to shore to see if anyone knew what was going on. For all we knew, the world was at war, and this was a reflection of that.
Wow.
Nothing. To this day, as I sit here, I have no idea what that was.
And it's not a known phenomenon.
Not a known phenomenon. No idea what it was. But I do know that I never would have experienced it had I not been out in that ocean in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. And it just kind of drives home the mystery of this world that we live in this nature that we live in. It's just absolutely extraordinary.
What's important about being in touch with the mystery? Another one of my guests, very different experience. He died, sudden cardiac death, for 30 minutes, was by all accounts and metrics dead, and was revived miraculously in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. And he brought up this idea of mystery and how much that experience had gotten him in touch with the idea of life's mystery. There's things we can kind of know, but much of life remains a mystery, and how important it is to embrace that. So what's important to you about mystery?
Yeah, isn't that the case, though? There's probably more. I mean, we know that there's so much more we don't know than what
well, I think we like
know.
to think that we know more than we do. But it's encounters like yours, encounters like my buddies that goes, holy smoke, we don't.
We know a lot less than there is that exists out there. And I think really being in touch with that is in many ways being in touch with the eternal, and really understanding that there is an eternal and kind of our role in it. It's so easy to lose that focus or that notion, that idea, when your day-to-day is spent on the day-to-day chores of living.
And what does it do for you to be in touch with the eternal and just that bigger reality? How does that impact you here in little old Steamboat, going about your business, litigating in the courtroom, planning expeditions? What's the impact?
There are a few. One of them is it certainly makes you to realize that the day-to-day problems that you tend to have probably aren't that big a deal when it comes down to it. So it really does drive that perspective. I think the other aspect, maybe it's the more important aspect of it, though, is to cause you or cause me to ask ourselves, really, what is the importance of our life? What are the important things that we're doing and that we're not doing? And how should we be living out our life in a way that is really a positive impact on others and an influence on others? How can we help? It helps to, I think, really drive empathy.
Beautiful. You've been in some harrowing experiences. What lessons have you learned from being at the edge of human ability and survival? When those moments where I don't know which way this is going. I mean, what's the lesson on that boundary?
Well, I think one of the main lessons that I've learned is that death can come at any time to anybody. And this isn't just, certainly it can happen out on an expedition, but it can happen to anybody at any point in life. Walking down the street in lovely Steamboat Springs, you could die of a heart attack or get hit by a car. Or as you walk home, learn that your loved one has cancer. And so I think that awareness is just so important, because when we do have that awareness, then I think can organize or arrange our lives in a better way to make the most of the life that we have while we have it. I'm often asked the question, why would you engage in such risky behavior? I don't consider myself a big risk taker, and I do manage the risk on the expeditions that I have. But people don't realize that the risk that they're living day in and day out, and they try to, I think, often, unfortunately, manage risk out of their lives to the point where they think that they're giving themselves safety, but they're just living in the illusion of safety. I know one of a focus of your podcast and what you do is about us realizing our mortality. our mortality is around us every moment of every day. The sooner we realize that and order our life accordingly, the better.
And in my opinion, we have at least two options when we are either forced or willing to confront our mortality, like its proximity, its inevitability. One is we can become more fearful and shrink back and try to double down on fortifying our perimeter. Or we can say, yep, there it is, and I'm gonna move forward courageously into the many, many perils of the world. And the bad news, I don't know if it's bad news or not, but the news is that whatever perils we might be able to conjecture in our own minds, it's far worse than that, actually. The list of possible perils we might confront in the world is way longer than we can conceive of.
Yeah.
So I think we have at least one of two choices: to shrink back and try to double down on fortifying our perimeter, or march courageously into the fray. And in my opinion, shrinking back only has negative results. I mean, you're a skier, and if we go up on the mountain and you and I ski a run that is a little bit above our ability level, the worst way to ski that run is really cautiously and fearfully.
That's right.
The best way to ski that run is with an aggressive mindset and aggressive stance.
That's right. Being committed.
That's the safest way to ski it for many physical reasons and just enjoyment reasons too. And so I hope our listeners will be willing to summon the courage in the moment in the face of the many perils of life. Number one, to realize how perilous life is. And number two, to be, Dan Torpedoes, full speed ahead. Dennis Franks, who sadly died this past fall, was on the podcast, and he played in the NFL in the 70s and early 80s. And I asked him, if you play timidly on the NFL gridiron, what is the cost? And he said, oh my gosh, I mean, you could die, you could be broken, and so if you step onto the NFL field, you've got to step in fully committed. And if you do that, your chances of walking off the field still alive and uninjured go way up. And it seems to me the same thing holds true in life. What keeps you going back?
Well, those passions are still there for me, and so I suppose they always will be, and so I suppose I'll keep going back in one form or another. I don't have any long-haul expeditions currently underway or in planning, so I'll have to wait for the moment to hit when I think it's time to get back out and do that again. In the meantime, I have other things, other projects, other life requirements going on.
You've had to spend time away from your family on these expeditions,
yes.
And sometimes out of contact, sometimes they're not aware of how you're doing, and you're not aware of how they're doing. What's the cost-benefit analysis there? Yeah,
well, I will say that I have a very, very understanding and gracious wife and family, and very supportive, and so I don't discount that one bit. In many ways, Lisa Renee understands it. She's a very accomplished athlete herself and has done some crazy things herself. And so she gets it from that perspective. But there is a price to be paid for sure, being gone for long periods of time, whether it's a price paid at work or even just a price being away from family and whatever's happening in their day-to-day lives. Really, for us, it's been a strengthening of our relationship, not a diminishing of our relationship. This may sound very prosaic or very, I don't know what the right word is,
cliche,
but cliched. But you fall in love with somebody for who that person is. She knew what I was about, and I knew what she was about. And so when we chose to get married, we also chose to support each other in those drives, in those passions. And so I'm glad that we've been able to do that. I think it's important to set that example for our kids too. So I can't think of anything worse than falling in love with somebody for who they are and then trying to spend the rest of your life trying to hold them back from who they are, even if it means their sacrifice.
What's worse than dying?
Living a life unengaged, living a diminished life, living a life in the grays and in the shadows.
Why is that worse? What's worse about that to you?
Look, we're all going to die. That is the one true thing that we all have and that we all face. So this notion that we should be sort of fixated on that, to me, is really it's asking the wrong question, because it's something that's going to happen to everyone. It's the common denominator. Let's look at what the numerator is then, right? How do you live a life in full color, despite the fact that you're going to die at some point? Or in light of the fact that you're going to, I think that notion of our mortality really needs to be driving what it means to live a full and well-lived life.
I saw a picture of you because I was Facebook stalking you. You were on a hike and you had a tattoo on your right lower leg.
I did. Would you like to see it?
Not right now. What significance is there to that tattoo?
Yeah. It's the for those obviously on the podcast who can't see me. It's a leg sleeve tattoo on my lower right leg. It's imagery from one of the books of the Bible, from Isaiah 40, is where the imagery comes from for that tattoo. Some of that long passage is about God lifting us up on wings of eagles and supporting us, and we're going to run and not grow weary, all out in nature.
And you inked that on yourself indelibly. Why that for you?
As a reminder of how to live life, as a reminder of what's important to me. One tattoo that you didn't see is one that I have on my left shoulder, and it's a tattoo of Ernest Shackleton coming into South Georgia Island in his small rowboat. And for the listeners who don't know that story, that is a story of adventure unparalleled.
Totally
and
unparalleled.
I highly recommend a book called Endurance, which is about that whole expedition. But I first read about Ernest Shackleton as a young child in the 4th grade and thought, gosh, I'd really like to do that someday. Not necessarily being shipwrecked or stranded,
right.
In Antarctica for a couple of years,
right.
but that being out on adventure. And so those tattoos really help to remind me in a very visual way of some of the things that are important to me.
You mentioned when we were talking before we started recording, there was a moment, I believe in the mountains, when you came closer to, I'll just say the eternal, capital E, than you had before, that became a defining moment for you. Would you mind sharing that and what it was about and what you got from it?
Yeah, so one of the purposes of that expedition, so it was this is a Denali expedition.
Your first one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this was the expedition after our friend had died. And one of the things that we were going to do was to throw some of his ashes from the summit. For those who don't know, Denali, it's a very, very difficult mountain because the weather is so extraordinarily bad. It's so cold, so windy, massive storms. And we had all of that all the way up to high camp. It was a very long and difficult, tough expedition.
What was the coldest temp you guys encountered?
It was on that probably negative, I want to say negative 30, negative 40 without the wind chill. With the wind chill, who knows, negative 70, negative 80 degrees. I mean, it was rough conditions. We were at high camp, and the plan was to move up the next day to the summit and hit the summit, release his ashes, come back down. Well, we got caught in a massive storm that moved in, and it was one of those where there were 3 of us in the tent, and we were having to sit with our backs up against the tent, pressing against the fabric and against the poles to try to stop the tent from blowing down or the poles from breaking and collapsing. So we had our backs against one side of the tent and our feet against the other all night. The conditions were like that to the point where the storm was just not going to abate. It seemed apparent that we were not going to be able to climb the next day. And so we were up all night. Obviously, you don't get any sleep in those types of conditions. But I am a Christian. Spent a lot of time in prayer and in reflection and meditation, even under those rough conditions. And I just really asked God for some sort of sign of what it was that He wanted us to do, what we were supposed to do. The next morning, even though the storm had not abated, we decided that we would go ahead and start preparing for an effort to go to the summit anyway, just to see how far we could get. And as we did all of our pre-climb preparations, the winds continued. The minute we stepped out to start climbing, the winds dropped to nothing. Complete stillness.
And that's not normal.
Complete stillness.
My goodness.
It causes me to shiver now when I think about it. We were able to make it to the summit. We did what we had come to do, got back down to our tent, and the storm set back in with full fury.
Holy smoke.
For yet another day or two, to the point where there was another climber who was on the mountain whose camp blew away. We had to rescue him, et cetera. So we were. This was really, really rough conditions. Fortunately, we all made it back down and all that. But that experience of just having the winds, the storms stilled, to allow us to accomplish what we had come to do, it was really a defining moment. And it caused me to reflect on the life that I live, on the Christian faith that I have, and the role that God plays in my life. It doesn't get any more defining than that for a person.
I can speculate what the impact might have been. I think for me, the impact might have been a profound sense of relief and security in knowing that there was something operating in this world with me and for me, and that I wasn't alone.
Very much so. And it also really gave me a profound sense of that mystery that we were speaking of earlier. I don't know if you know the Ernest Shackleton story, but in part of it, this is all toward the end of the story, and he and two of his teammates were making the traverse of South Georgia Island to try to reach a whaling station
after spending several days in rotten seal fur sleeping bags and frigid,
et cetera. all the 2-year lead up to get to that point they'd done, but they were hiking toward this whaling station. There were 3 of them, and one of the things that Shackleton said is he had this profound sense of presence of a 4th person who was with them during that very difficult stretch of trip. And that's the same sense that I had on Mount McKinley on that particular day.
We're not alone. What do you want us to learn from your experience? If you could bottle a message that each of us would get perfectly as intended, what might that be?
I think it's one of the first things that we talked about, which is figure that thing out that you're intended to do, put a name to it, and put a schedule to it, and then commit to doing it. Whatever it is, the bigger the better. The more profound, the better. At the end of the day, you may not make that goal. One of my expeditions was trying to ski solo to the South Pole. I made it a lot of the way, didn't make it all the way. But you may not make that goal, but you'll go further, you'll see more, do more, understand more than you otherwise will if you don't set that goal and actually put it into place.
Final question. If you knew you were going to die 5 years from today, what would you change immediately starting today?
Probably the same thing that I did change back in the day. Work less, spend more time with family, spend more time with friends, spend more time doing those things I enjoy doing.
Because you might die today.
That's exactly right.
Thanks so much for sharing some of your story and your journey and your hard-won wisdom. It's certainly been a benefit to me. I know will be to listeners. And I want to remind our listeners, you are going to die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it. Doug's extreme adventures have taught him about the riches available to us when we listen to the call of our heart and follow it wherever it leads us. The bigger, the better. The more profound, the better. We go further, see more, do more, and understand more when we respond to our heart's call than we ever would otherwise, even if we don't fully achieve the thing that we set out to do. We'll live life in full color rather than a diminished life in the grays and in the shadows, diluted by a false sense of safety and security. I want that full color kind of life. What about you? What call of your heart are you suppressing, shrinking away from in fear, or stalled out on because the many overwhelming hows are distracting you from the more important what? Maybe you can't yet hear the call of your heart because it's drowned out by the white noise of day-to-day living. Maybe it's time for some solitude, reflection, and contemplation, so your heart's call can begin to make itself known to you. What's your heart telling you right now? Whatever it is, do that thing. What stuck with you from this episode? Message me on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.